Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. My name is Matt Taylor. I'm the Protestant scholar here at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. And our mission at ICJS is to build learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. So this afternoon, we are going to be looking at some recent events in our country's history, and especially around the Capitol riot on January 6th and some of the different religious images and ideas that were in there. And I'm going to bring my fellow scholars in with some different questions that we have, and then we'll open it up for you all to ask some questions. If you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to put those into the chat, and our staff will be kind of gathering those and collating those so that we can have them in a format that works for us. I want to just set us up with two key takeaways that hopefully we can return to at the very end, but two things that we really want to emphasize through our conversation today. The first of these is we talk a lot about the separation of religion and state, or the separation of church and state in American history. And we want to complicate that a little bit in the hour that we have together, and recognize that actually our political and our religious identities are not so easily separable. And our politics informs our religious identities, and our religious identities inform our politics, and those identities can merge and meld. And that was a lot of what we saw happening on January 6th, as we will discuss. The other point that we want to emphasize, and I'm going to throw out two terms, and then I'm going to define them both. So Christian nationalism is antithetical to the value of religious pluralism. So Christian nationalism, and there's been a lot of scholarship coming out recently, especially there was a book in 2020 by Samuel Whitehead and Andrew Perry that is titled Taking America Back for God. And it talks, there are two sociologists looking at this phenomenon of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is this idea that America is intrinsically a Christian nation, has always been, and should be a Christian nation, and that Christianity, in particular a form of white Christianity, should be privileged above other religious identities in America. So that's Christian nationalism, and we're arguing that that is antithetical to the concept of religious pluralism. Religious pluralism is this idea that America is a nation of many religions and many identities that are not religious, and that all of those should be treated equally, and that that diversity in America should be engaged proactively. A lot of what we do at ICJS is building for religious pluralism here in Baltimore and around the country. And the threat that we saw on January 6th, and I would argue that Christian nationalism is one of the greatest threats that we see today to this idea and this value of religious pluralism. So again, our religious and our political identities merge and meld in all kinds of ways, and Christian nationalism is a grave threat to religious pluralism. I also just want to note at the start that while our analysis this afternoon is going to focus in on the events surrounding January 6th, these phenomena, these challenges did not end on January 6th. They did not end on January 20th with the new administration. We are holding this event where just last week we saw a white Christian go and shoot up some different Asian American spas in Atlanta. There were three. He viciously attacked and murdered 8 people at these 3 different spas, and said that he was eradicating sexual temptation, even as he murdered especially 6 women of Asian descent. And so the themes, the challenges that we're facing today they didn't terminate at the end of January 6th. These are ongoing challenges that we're facing in terms of Christian supremacy and Christian violence. And we want to take that seriously as we go along today. And maybe we'll have time to discuss some of the continuity that we see between January 6th and the Atlanta shootings that we saw last week. So I'm going to share a few slides with you just to give you a sense of what was happening on January 6th and the lead up to January 6th, give you some images. This is going to be a whirlwind tour of the religious images and symbols that were on display in the aftermath of the election leading up to the insurrection. And then we will invite our scholars in to kind of comment and discuss some of these different images. So I think we really need to start talking about January 6th actually in December. And there was an event, actually a series of events and marches called the Jericho March The main event of these was organized on December 12th. So this is a month after the election had been called for Joe Biden. But these were people who were still praying and protesting and hoping for some sort of miraculous intervention that would allow Donald Trump to have a second term. This was organized by a Catholic and an evangelical. They partnered together to start this event. And they were implicitly invoking the image of the Battle of Jericho. From the Hebrew Bible, where the ancient Israelites marched and prayed and waited for God to destroy the walls of the city of Jericho. And this culminated in a 5-hour event on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. on December 12th. And if you watch through those 5 hours, I have done that. I don't particularly recommend it, but it's overall, it has a very evangelical and Pentecostal charismatic vibe, very much at home in American Protestantism. As you see this man prominently brandishing his open Bible during the march. The gentleman in the blue tie and the sweater vest is Eric Metaxas, who served as the MC for the 5-hour event. He's a conservative evangelical commentator and author. But you had some things that did not fit neatly within kind of our impressions of, say, white evangelicalism. So for instance, you had a Catholic priest blessing an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe on the stage. You also had Archbishop Vigano, a controversial figure in international Roman Catholic politics, recorded a video endorsing this march. And you also had some folks invoking different forms of Judaism. For instance, there was this man here blowing the 2 shofars. He introduces himself as an Orthodox Jew who crafts shofars for a living. These are ram's horns that are used in Jewish liturgy, especially around the high holidays. But he said that he got permission from his Orthodox rabbi in Israel to come to this Jericho March on a Saturday on Shabbat to blow the shofar in support of Donald Trump. So you have, again, a variety of different religious expressions here. And I would just note that after this march, this Jericho March on December 12th, there was a night of near rioting in Washington, D.C., where some of the Proud Boys, another group that has come to national prominence in the last year, vandalized an African-American church and tore down and burned a Black Lives Matter banner from that church. So even as you have these folks protesting for religious freedom and Christians' rights, they're also attacking, or at least some of them seem to be attacking an African-American church in DC over political issues. So then, of course, Donald Trump invites his supporters to come to DC on January 6th and to protest the counting of the electoral votes. There are a number of different events surrounding that January 6th event. It wasn't all located on January 6th itself. Especially there was this event organized by Alex Jones, who runs the organization InfoWars, a conspiracy theorist named Alex Jones. And they organized it on January 5th, the afternoon before the march. And this was in Freedom Plaza in downtown DC. Now, this is similar to the Jericho March. This was ostensibly a political event, and yet many of the people who are speaking there are Christian pastors, including this man, Che An, who's a Korean-American pastor from Pasadena, California. You had bands that were playing evangelical worship music and leading the crowd in praise songs in between these different political and religious speakers. It had a real feel of kind of a revival meeting almost, but again, all focused on supporting Donald Trump. And just to give you a flavor of the rhetoric and themes from this event, here's this quote, again, from Pastor Che An, who is, by the way, not at all a marginal figure. He actually leads an international network of 20,000 churches and ministries all over the world. He got his PhD from Fuller Theological Seminary, which is also my alma mater. And he said, "This is the most important week in America's history. We are going to rule and reign through President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ, because I'm telling you the consequences are severe if Biden or Harris becomes president. We're going to take a stand until justice prevails, because the foundation of God's throne is justice and righteousness. And we're going to say yes to justice this week, and we're going to see President Trump be our president for the next 4 years. In perpetuity, we're going to be a red nation." So again, very much blending kind of his Christian identity with his political identity and with the political future of America. So on the next day, on January 6th itself, the day started with what was sometimes called the Save America March or the Stop the Steal rally. And you'll remember this is where Donald Trump actually addressed the rally on the Ellipse at the National Mall. And there too, you saw many, many expressions of religious fervor and identity. And if you're interested in exploring this more, by the way, there's a colleague of Zainab and mine who also graduated from the Georgetown PhD program in theology, Peter Manseau, started a hashtag, capital Siege religion, where different scholars and journalists have been cataloging all this different imagery that came up. So you have things like this flag that there are many people actually carrying this flag saying, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. So you have this conflation of religious and political identities, a neat encapsulation of Christian nationalism if I ever saw one. But you also had some more idiosyncratic elements, like this guy carrying an Israeli flag, along with a poster that says, say yes to Jesus. Okay, so Israeli flag and say yes to Jesus. A reporter actually encountered another woman carrying an Israeli flag. Her name was Kelly, and asked her why she was carrying an Israeli flag at this political rally for Donald Trump. And she said, and this is a quote, "My Lord and Savior was Jewish. He was from Israel. The Bible says if you bless Israel, you should be blessed. So we're a nation that supports Israel." So you have kind of Israeli politics and Christian Zionism getting mixed in with the support for Donald Trump. As you start moving closer to the Capitol, and you have these different crowds converging on the Capitol building itself, there are all kinds of flags and banners and religious expressions on display. In fact, I heard an interview with a Capitol Police officer who was inside the building trying to defend the building. And at one point, as he's pressing against these mobs in the building, he looks out a window and sees just this mass of people with all kinds of banners flying over. He said it looked like a scene from a medieval battle, with all these tribal flags flying over this massing crowd of people just surging against the building. And some of these flags have obvious Christian nationalist tones, like this big Jesus 2020 banner, but some of them are actually harder to parse. So you have here a QAnon flag. It's a little bit hard to see, but there were actually many QAnon flags. And QAnon is this now infamous conspiracy theory that Trump was secretly scheming to overthrow a liberal cabal of elite leftist pedophiles, which sounds absurd, of course, but there's actually a lot of evangelical rhetoric and idiom mixed in with QAnon, as a number of scholars have pointed out. You have also this non-denominational Protestant Christian flag, which is the red cross on a blue background. I grew up going to evangelical Protestant schools, and every morning we would pledge allegiance to that Christian flag. And now here you see it on display. Obviously, this person thinks of themselves as expressing their Christian faith in this attack. I'm not sure what to make of it, but somebody was carrying around a God Country Notre Dame flag, which is a piece of paraphernalia for supporting the University of Notre Dame's football team. But for some reason, someone felt that this was a way to show that they were supporting the events of the storming of the Capitol. And then you have this green pine tree on a white background flag that says an appeal to heaven on it. Interesting history on this flag. It actually comes from the phrase, an appeal to heaven, comes from a treatise by John Locke about the Glorious Revolution in Great Britain in the 17th century. It's about the people's right to overthrow their unjust government. After they've made their appeals on earth, they can make an appeal to heaven through revolution. And so this got picked up during the Revolutionary War, and this became a flag of the Massachusetts Navy for a while. But just within the last decade or so, it has been appropriated by Christian conservatives, especially some charismatic evangelicals, who have started using it as a symbol of a coming third great awakening in America that will make America a more conservative and biblical nation. So if you look through the pictures and the images from the storming of the Capitol, you actually see these appeal to heaven flags everywhere. They're throughout the different crowds. And just a couple more slides here. Outside the Capitol, you had a guy, and actually there were a number of people showing images of the Crusader Cross, invoking the images of the Crusades. This guy has it on his shirt here in the upper left-hand corner. And we'll talk a little bit more about what is going on with that image and why the Crusades were being invoked. You also have at the bottom left a Catholic priest who was from Nebraska, who ran into a documentary filmmaker and got filmed and interviewed. And he claimed that he had gone into the Capitol building and performed an exorcism because a demon had taken hold of Congress, a demon of disunity, and he had to exorcise that demon. And he's holding up his exorcism manual. I'll just note that when this video surfaced, this priest was actually rebuked by the Archdiocese of Omaha. It said he's not a legitimate exorcist and was not acting on behalf of the Catholic Church. You have shofars, which in the Bible are used in the Battle of Jericho, and Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, actually filmed what appears to be the woman on the right in the lower picture, going up to the window, the broken windows of the Capitol building, and blowing her shofar into the building. And we can try to think about what she thought she was doing with that. And then the last slide here, once you got inside the Capitol, the FBI estimates that there were about 800 people that entered into the Capitol building that day. But again, many of them are signaling their religious and Christian nationalist identities. You have these two guys decked out in paramilitary gear with their gas masks on, who clearly they're there to brawl. They're there to fight. They're there anticipating a police response. And if we zoom in on the patches on this guy's arm, we see that one of the patches says armor of God with a cross. And the other one has the Punisher's skull from comic books, but it says, God will judge our enemies, we'll arrange the meeting. Threatening violence, very clearly invoking violence. And you also have the puzzling case in the upper right there of the Q shaman. This is the guy with the bull horns and the naked torso with tattoos from Norse mythology. And on the day of and immediate aftermath of the Capitol riots, you had a number of people talking about how this guy was somehow blending the QAnon conspiracy theory with New Age religion and shamanism and these white supremacist symbols that he had tattooed on his body. But then a few days later, the New Yorker actually released a video from inside that was taken by one of its reporters from inside the Capitol that showed this Q shaman leading a prayer in the Senate chamber. He climbed up on the dais and gathered the rioters who were in there to offer a prayer. And this prayer he actually offers is in a very evangelical idiom. He's praying to Heavenly Father. He's thanking God for filling this chamber with patriots who love Christ. And he ends his prayer in Christ's holy name. So what is this guy? Is he a shaman? Is he a New Age person? Is he with QAnon? Is he an evangelical? It seems like a bit of all of the above. So there you go. That's all the kind of chaotic imagery. I realized that was a very fast whirlwind tour, but I'm going to bring in my fellow scholars one by one, and I'll introduce them as I bring them in. And I'm going to show a couple more images just to set up some questions with our scholars. So first, let me bring in Ben Sachs, who's our Jewish scholar. This is a famous photograph from the Capitol riot. This guy has on a shirt that says Camp Auschwitz. And on the back it says of his sweatshirt, it says staff, very much offering himself, saying I work at Camp Auschwitz, a very almost pro-Holocaust, deeply anti-Semitic image. But then we also had, as we saw, people carrying around Israeli flags and expressing a form of kind of Christian Zionism. So how do you make sense? This feels contradictory. How do you make sense of the fact that these people marching together side by side, the overt anti-Semites and Christian Zionists?
On the surface, it does seem very difficult to make sense of that. What I think might be helpful is to go back a few years to the closing salvo argument of the Trump campaign that featured a video with Lloyd Blankfeld, Janet Yellen, George Soros. Every time three Jewish people, and every time their image showed up, it was with the words global elites bleeding us dry, pulling the levers of power. And critics said that this was drawing attention to the protocols, the elders of Zion, Jewish conspiracy theories. and that there was a consensus that this was anti-Semitic. And then you add on some of the, Trump's famous Charlottesville remarks, his refusal to condemn people like David Duke. And so you start to see a place where people can feel empowered in this political movement to have these kinds of beliefs. And on the other hand, Trump's daughter and son-in-law are Jewish. He moved the US embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, which was a move celebrated by Christian Zionists and a number of Jewish Zionists. He adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism into government agencies, which includes things like saying that Israel is a racist endeavor, is anti-Semitic, accusing Jews of having dual loyalty, loyalty to other Jews, at the same time loyalty to the United States or loyalty to Israel over the United States is anti-Semitic. And then on the other hand, you have Trump at Republican Jewish donor meetings talking about Israel as their country, and complaining about Jewish voters that they're not showing him gratitude for moving the embassy. And so on the one hand, it seems contradictory. On the other hand, it's taking in a really toxic political environment where political movements seem to be consolidating. It's creating an opportunity for Christian Zionists who don't always love Jews. Love of Israel isn't always love of Jews, with the hope of bringing in some Jewish people into the movement, but a place where Israel can be supported and anti-Semites can be supported. And I think a really great example of this is Richard Spencer, who is a white nationalist, some would argue vehemently anti-Semitic, and yet is also a Zionist. It makes sense in terms of this political movement. So rather than trying to make sense of it as just all littered with contradictions, also look at that in Israel as a country, Trump has a high approval rating. Even a town was named after him. The train station by the Western Wall is named after him. So it's a political movement with a lot of different conflicting opportunities, but it really is consistent with the zeitgeist of this political movement.
I'm going to bring in our Roman Catholic scholar and executive director, Heather Miller Rubens. I'm a Protestant, Heather, and I saw that our second Catholic president was elected, and congratulations on that, by the way. This was a day of certifying the election for Joe Biden, our second Catholic president. So I'm assuming that this was a moment of unmitigated American Catholic jubilation around the election of our second Catholic president. I'm right?
Thank you for such a wonderful and humorous setup. You are delightfully wrong or sadly wrong on this moment. The American Catholic Church is just as divided as the American public right now, and the events of January 6th, the lead-up events, demonstrate that really sharp and violent division within the church. Just speaking briefly, Catholics are quite a large group in the US context. There are 70 million Catholics in the US today. We make up roughly 20% of the US population. But we are not a homogenous group. We're an incredibly diverse group. And Catholic teachings do not sit cleanly with either party's platform, right? So being Catholic and being pro-life means opposing abortion and opposing the death penalty. Catholic teachings command us to sort of recognize the rights and obligations of the worker and the employer, of the migrant and the citizen. And so there's ways that our current divisions and polarization within our politics don't sit cleanly with church teachings. And that was really on display both with the Jericho March and on January 6th. I would say, speaking for myself, that Joe Biden's election and his inauguration and everything about him is just it's welcome to me as an individual, but it is in sharp contrast when we think about our first Catholic president, JFK, sort of what the expectations and the fears and the anxieties are. Biden is an incredibly pious man, and he carries his religious identity comfortably and very visibly. He's a regular mass goer. He's been seen in prayer and in a rosary. The image that you threw up there was him. He was visiting a Protestant church during the run up to the election, and he sort of made the sign of the cross. And for Catholics who this is a regular prayer, he is making the sloppy Catholic sign of the cross. It's something that you can tell that he does regularly, and it's not like very precise the way my kids do it. It's something that he clearly does all the time. He also, in the Oval Office, and there's other photos of this, he has a photo of himself with Pope Francis that he has sitting right behind him in the Oval Office. And so when you see photos of Biden, you'll see Pope Francis in the background. And that's what's really important to understand about January 6th, is that Pope Francis is in the background. And so there's a sort of larger division within the Catholic community about the leadership of Pope Francis, and how it relates to sort of bigger Catholic teachings. And so there's a split along the lines of what does it mean to be Catholic? What does it mean to be Catholic and political? And I think one of the hardest things about this has been that people have really come out strongly in saying that Biden isn't an authentic Catholic. So they're not only challenging the authenticity of the election, they're challenging the authenticity of his identity.
I'd like to bring in our fourth scholar, Zainab Sailgan, our Muslim scholar. And Zainab, let me put it in these images of these Crusader crosses. It was not just the guy with the shirt. There was also, if you notice, these three guys here carrying flags with the Crusader crosses on them. And so you have multiple people here invoking the Crusades, even as they're storming the US Capitol. And so my question for you, Zainab, is what do you make of the role as a Muslim in America, as a Muslim scholar, what do you make of the role that these images of the Crusades are playing in the symbolic universe of Christian nationalism? And what does that say about the space of Muslims in this so-called Christian America?
Thank you, Matt. I think these are perfect, examples how religion and politics are blended together. And I think when I see the Crusader Cross, I think many of us, the symbol is often spotted on white supremacist marches. And in our public imagination, I think the Crusaders simply stand for this somewhat distorted understanding that the Christian West and Islamic East are inherently at war and conflict with each other, and that Christians need to take back the country from invading Muslims, infiltrating our system, or generally all immigrants, and trying to purify, the country from these foreign elements. Let's just also note that the Crusades have a very complicated history. I think people fought each other, but we also have, accounts showing how they tolerated each other. But of course, this nuanced narrative doesn't come up and is mostly ignored, in the manifestos of these right-wing militias. We've seen, for example, in the shootings and that happened in New Zealand a few years ago in Christchurch, that the person who committed these crimes actually referred to some of these Christian crusaders, and in his manifesto really connected, brought in the names. And so the Crusades have really immense propaganda value to anyone who wishes to suggest that the Islamic world and the Christian West are engaged in a permanent civilizational war. And so there seems to be no escape, and there can only be one winner. I think that reminds me also a little bit, of the angry young man. These white supremacists from the far right also mirror somewhat the language often used by Islamist extremists and ISIS fighters who glorify suicide bombings and other terror attacks on Westerners and Christians. And I think one of the viewers, just commented, I think Reverend Friedrich was his name, that, we had the Atlanta shooting, a self-identified Christian, and then we had the shooting in Colorado Boulder, a self-identified Muslim. So there is no monopoly, of course, on any religious community doesn't have a monopoly on terrorism, and that each of our communities are, trying to address, these issues. I also want to say that especially for Muslims, and especially Black Muslims, what happened on January 6th showed a very clear difference in treatment and how law enforcement treats white riders. And there is also a deep concern within the Muslim community that when stricter legislation, is enforced, that it inevitably turns on communities of color and Muslims. And so some civil organizations have also noted and raised concern that is this, stricter legislation on terrorism or, domestic terror, is also covered to crush protest movements and social justice groups. So they're really raising alarms on that as well.
I want us to try to unpack this guy a little bit. He's carrying a spear with an American flag attached to it. As I mentioned, he has symbols of Norse religion tattooed on his body, as well as an image of apparently the wall that Trump was proposing to build. He is at different points issuing kind of guttural chants, and then at the same time using evangelical idioms to pray in the name of Jesus. So we're all a bunch of scholars of religion, and I'm going to just appropriate the title of the event. What's going on here? Thoughts?
There's a lot going on there, as you just sort of nicely illustrated. I think the thing that strikes me about the Q shaman, and to build off of the conversation we were just having about crusade, is the fact that the sort of Northern European mythology, the sort of attachment to kind of a whiteness, and it's brushing up and overlapping with a certain type of Christian belief, also has a long and ugly history, right? And so there's this sort of sense in which, by him both speaking in an evangelical idiom and offering a prayer in the name of Jesus Christ, while also sort of embodying this kind of Nordic, appropriating a kind of Nordic identity, is a sort of affirmation of a specifically kind of white Christianity. And so it's not really surprising. And my mind goes back to the way in which certain, in the sort of run up to the Holocaust, certain Nazism was sort of trucking in both sort of a Nordic mythology as well as a Christian mythology, and those things, that tension was there as well.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think it's a very exoticized image, and I hail from Germany, and I see all these like Viking elements, embraced by the far right movement in Europe, and so it's not something that is really unique to domestic these right-wing people here in the United States, but it's often adopted to really drive home this kind of pure white Christianness. And and even the Vikings were very multicultural people. I think even there, this idea of going back to this pure whiteness is a very ahistorical kind of, understanding.
And it's also representative of our current climate and how we talk about religion, because a lot about how he manifested his identity was part of that spiritual, not religious in some capacity, in that the sort of cynicism of, you have a buffet of different religious ideas and you take what appeals to you, mentality that usually gets associated with left-wing spirituality, usually taking from Eastern traditions. This person in the same way is taking from Nordic traditions, evangelical traditions, I believe even Native American. And so it's creating an identity from all these different perceived spiritualities to fit a political or ethnocentric political identity that for many people, and this is the consistency argument, would seem contradictory, because Native American and white supremacist at the same time. But in a culture that really does see religion in a consumerist way, in what it can do for me, and that it's about my relationship as opposed to something collective or what's owed to me or what I see, is something I think is also going on with the person in the picture.
I would just also note that I mentioned this as we were running through some of the slides, but there has been this interpenetration of QAnon and evangelicalism that is actually very disturbing, that has happened over the last couple of years or so. And you find significant percentages of American evangelicals who endorse some part of the QAnon conspiracy theory. So it's telling to me that he's got this wild mix, as Ben was saying, this kind of buffet style of religious identity. But when he goes to pray with this group of people, he defaults into this kind of evangelical idiom that is in some ways the vocabulary of American civic religion. And so there's a way that kind of white Protestantism is underlying all of this in some sense. I'm going to transition now and we'll take some questions from the audience. And so again, if you are in the audience and have a question, feel free to put that in the chat and we'll be adding those into the discussion here. We have a question that I'm going to throw to Zainab first. Can you perhaps expound on the lack of a visible Muslim presence? I would note that there were a number of different immigrant groups that were part of the Save America March, not necessarily the storming of the Capitol. And one of the groups was Iranian Americans carrying the flag of the Iran pre-revolution. So I'm not necessarily, I don't know if they're Muslim or not, but they were carrying kind of a flag of Iran before the 1979 revolution. There were also immigrant groups from Cuba, from South Korea, from Vietnam, places where communism has in some sense threatened those spaces and part of this narrative of Trump fighting back communism. But there was some Iranian folks who were present during the march, but overall, very little presence as far as we can tell of Muslims. But we know that, I don't know, maybe 25, 30%, depending on the poll, of American Muslims did support Trump in the 2020 election. Why do you think there weren't Muslims present in this space in the way that we saw different Jews and especially a lot of Christians present?
That's a very good question, and I think you shared a while ago, a presentation by a friend of yours. I think Professor Yusuf was his name, who showed
Yusuf Shahood.
Exactly, and he showed in his presentation that the American Muslim, voter community is not a monolith, and that in fact we do have, American Muslims who have voted, as you just noted. 30% of American Muslim votes went for Trump. And so I would say that, 70% of American Muslims are, generally traditionally democratically leaned. So I think they are aware of this, very racist rhetoric that is in the right wing, in these groups, especially by these QAnon marchers. And so I would my simple answer would be that there is a, conscious opting out from these kind of gatherings, and also, that Muslims are aware that they're not subscribing to this kind of ideology.
And I would just observe from my own research on the American Muslim community, I would say the American Muslims who did tend to support Trump, it was very much of a transactional kind of relationship. It was like, oh, we agree with him on X, Y, and Z, but it was conditional, not quite the level of support that we saw from some of the Christian elements. I'd also point out that there's a long-running narrative that America is not just a Christian nation, but a Judeo-Christian nation, a way of kind of separating out Jews and Christians from Muslims. And I think that was very much on display. I'm sure Ben has thoughts on the conflation of Judeo-Christian. Do you want to jump in on that, Ben, or do you want to leave that for another day?
We can put into a chat a journal that I edited on the term Judeo-Christian and sort of the history of it and the problems of it in the contemporary political world.
As I was thinking more about this, why Muslims, or the 30% of Trump voters, American Muslim Trump voters, were not present. I mean, I know, Muslim Trump voters, and there was also, the sense of they don't want to express that they voted for him. They really did feel uncomfortable in publicly stating that, and felt kind of being bullied by the larger American Muslim community. So I had a friend, she told me, I voted for Trump but I'm kind of in secret because I don't feel comfortable sharing that, because I know I'm going to be bullied by my fellow Muslims. So there's also, I think, this sense of kind of you don't want to, be publicly out there and expressing your political views.
So you put a question in here about what's the line between free speech and protest, and then those who clearly moved into insurrection and breaching the Capitol building. And maybe I'd add, what role does religious identity play in people deciding to cross that line? Right? How do you think about the motives of people who may show up to protest, and then what impels someone to cross that line, to attack police officers, to try to breach one of our government buildings?
I can weigh in quickly on the free speech comment. One of my areas of research is religion and law, so I'll just kind of get to that quickly. The US has an incredibly robust notion of free speech. And so all of that speech, all of those signs, all of those flags is totally legal. And the ICJS isn't making any sort of arguments to say that it should be any way else. Even I noticed in the chat, even the discussion and the sweatshirt around Auschwitz, that's all free speech, that's all protected in the US context. And so we'll kind of maybe just answer that directly, and then we can move on to the other questions.
I think when we also look at when we think about religion and the role that it's playing in these sorts of attacks, I think we also have to think about the narratives of good versus evil. And right, so you have this Catholic priest who's saying there's a demon, right? And actually, there were a number of charismatic evangelicals who were making similar claims about that there are demonic forces that have taken over the U.S. Capitol building that are guiding these Congress people to do this. And once you have that Manichaean narrative, that narrative of good versus evil, those people who are storming the Capitol are not thinking they're on the side of evil. They're not thinking they're on the side of injustice, right? Pastor Che Ahn is saying that he's for justice, that what they are doing in these protests is for justice. That narrative of we are on the side of good allows you to dehumanize, allows you to set aside a lot of the kind of moral frameworks that you might be operating with normally and say, no, what we are doing now is moral, right? And that's what many of the people, and I would say most of the people who are doing this were thinking. They thought they were on the side of right.
The rabbi at the Jericho March, he justified his blowing of 2 shofars on Shabbat by saying a rabbi in Israel said it was okay because in doing so, he would be saving a life. And there's a tradition in Judaism that you can violate Shabbat law that when somebody's life is on the line. There's also a long Talmudic tradition of what's called the rodef, that if somebody's intending on killing someone, you can actually preemptively kill that person before they commit that sin. And so then there's a certain urgency in that kind of religious language that all other avenues have been exhausted, that this is the last thing. And then related to the pictures, he sought his authority from a rabbi in Israel and not the United States. So again, it's this idea of a Jew in the Holy Land. He made it clear to say that it was an Orthodox rabbi, so traditionalist, and that we're going to violate law, and idiosyncratically, like blowing a shofar and relating to saving someone's life is probably not connected, at least in Talmudic writings, but it creates that sense that we have to do this now. We've run out of options, and there's a religious impetus behind it.
To go back to the opening, you talked about the priest from Omaha, Nebraska, the Catholic priest who brought along materials and claimed that he was doing an exorcism. One of the benefits of being in a hierarchical church, right, is that there's a bishop who could come out and say, no, he's not an officially trained exorcist. No, he is not doing this on behalf of the church, right? And then you cleared that up at the beginning. But I almost think that conversation isn't the interesting conversation. I think that the good evil conversation, right? If he fundamentally believed that a devil had possessed society and possessed the Capitol, he felt compelled to act in a sort of a religious way to sort of remove that evil. I don't want to make, it's not in a direct comparison, but I think it's helpful to think about the slogan of the Biden campaign, right? It was the battle for the soul of the nation. There's a way in which we've reached a point with our polarization that we do believe that the other side is evil in a way that doesn't allow for any sort of gray, or doesn't really sort of create space for, like you said, humanization or conversation. And then that framing, then the violence of January 6th from the vantage point of the people who are perpetrating the violence becomes holy violence, becomes entirely justified and righteous violence. And trying to sort of talk about that in a way that doesn't make them, we're not calling them insane, we're not making them a sort of caricature, but actually takes them seriously about where they're standing. That's, I think, a sort of first step to try to understand some of this stuff, but it's also a really hard step to take.
I want to bring us back to the mission of the ICJS, right? In order to dismantle religious bias and bigotry, we build learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. That was certainly not on display on January 6th, right? The all kinds of religious bias and bigotry was there, and religious difference was being exploited in many ways in order to perpetrate very unethical and painful behaviors in order to try to take back our country. How do we move forward? And what can we do? I'm assuming that the members of our audience are people who did not tune in because they were in any way in support of the events on January 6th. What can we do proactively to try to stand against these forces in our society? And are there effective ways to dismantle some of these things that we see going on?
I feel like we need to have the capacity to talk about good and evil. And I also think we didn't really touch on today the idea of truth. And the sort of epistemic challenges of January 6th, the fact that so many people think that the election wasn't valid, right? We're operating in entirely different truth universes, right? Alternative facts has become a sort of catchword. That's really dangerous as a society to really end up having entirely hermetically sealed different worlds that you're living in. And so I think trying to create space and opportunity to really say what's true, what's good, what's evil, and equip people to have those conversations is a step in the right direction.
I agree entirely. I think there is such a strong or deep climate of suspicion and mistrust, always, even in the conspiracy theories, or even with the vaccination rollout now, that human beings, inherently evil and they need to be mistrusted, they're after us. But generally the people in our lives, daily lives, we encounter as kind people. And I don't know why there's always this kind of this climate of suspicion that there are certain lobbies and people who are like orchestrating a certain evil to kind of oppress us. So on either side, and this is not something really, again, in the US context, you see it again in Germany, where I come from, in Turkey, the same kind of conspiracy theories, the same kind of mistrust, the same kind of global suspicion towards each other as human beings. I mean, there needs to be, I think, we end up in being in these bubbles where it's very easy, especially in the social media world, to unfriend and block people who don't agree with us. And I think it takes each of us in being involved to really reach out and build, we're very keen and passionate about relationship building, to come out of that comfort zone and engage in very difficult conversations. There's no other way to break that kind of segregated, universe.
Having lived in separate bubbles, one the bubble of Baltimore City, and then the bubble of Appalachia in Blacksburg, Virginia, where truth claims are understood very differently when it comes to religion and politics. I felt it wasn't simply a matter of emotional uncomfort. I was physically threatened simply for being Jewish. This was a long time ago now, but the feelings that people associated with me, or the ideas that people associated with me simply by being different, it generated a worldview that could have grown in me that was simply reactionary, and that I didn't really want to engage in that culture. But that's to say that also this didn't start with Trump. This has been going on in our country since its establishment. These are debates and divisions that we've had where people have felt threatened and people have been murdered as a result of it. And so when looking into how we think forward, how we do this together, also know that this is not just addressing our present moment, but the entire weight of the history of this country in terms of its racism, and its, at times, its intolerance towards religious others. And so there's no panacea, there's no easy fix to this, but to recognize people's pain rather than interpret it for them. That if people feel threatened or people feel exposed, ask clarifying questions rather than trying to interpret their feelings out of existence.
This project of American religious pluralism, this idea of having a multi-racial, multi-religious, diverse society, is just a very difficult one. We haven't seen a lot of examples of democracies that have the level of diversity that we have, that have lasted for very long. And so I think it's a challenge that I think is before our country, and before us as people who are committed to that vision to really work on building that. And I don't think you can build religious pluralism when you say, we'll just ignore that 46% of the country over there. I grew up as a white evangelical. People's minds can be changed, and there are lovely people on the other side who are also carrying around some really awful ideas. And I think we need to build relationship, we need to build friendship, find ways to bridge the gaps and draw people into conversation, draw people into dialogue. And that is the work that we do at ICJS. So please come and join us in this work and keep coming out for stuff like this. And please go and engage that project of religious pluralism in your world, in your community. Thank you.